started to speak about last time was investments in specialized capital, human capital, that occurred after one finished, typically, in the main part, after one finishes, let's say, formal schooling, and people invest in knowledge that makes them better prepared to handle particular skills. And what's important in an economy, if you think of it from an economy-wide point of view, is that various skills have to be used together to produce total output. I mean, not necessarily fixed proportion, but they're used together. You need a lot of skills to produce the output in a modern economy. And what happens with economic development is that you get the emergence of more and more finely tuned specializations and division of labor. So modern economy, world economy, look at the tremendous division of labor there is in the modern world economy. I mean, the famous example is people hold up the pencil and they look at, say, well, where did the pencil come from? This, and it comes from all over the place. It's a pen, but I have no idea where everything comes from in this, but you know, a lot of it is imported. The whole pen may be imported, I'm not quite sure. It may be made here, but the ingredients will be imported. So there's a global specialization that leads to a lot of different specialized activities by industry, by occupation, all the things we mentioned last time you find in the world economy. All right, so the basic factor in all this is increasing returns to scale. That as a scale, as an individual's scale of a particular activity increases, the efficiency of the activity goes up. Now, there may be increasing returns to an economy, to an industry. Those are, I'm not going to emphasize those, although they'll be partly related to what I say, because under certain circumstances, the increasing returns that I will be concerned with does lead to increasing returns to the economy or to an industry. And you have a famous statement by Adam Smith, division of labor is limited by the extent of the economy. Okay? So that's the kind of specialization and increasing returns that we're going to be dealing with. All right? And we're concentrating on the human capital component. There are other forms of specialization in the economy, but we'll be concentrating on the human capital component. Okay. And we've seen a part of that already when we discussed schooling, that we saw basically a form of increasing returns there, that if you work longer hours, it pays more to invest in highly specialized education or extensive education, right? So you're going to go to university that's going to raise your skills in the market sector, then, and you're only going to work a few hours in the market sector, it doesn't pay for you to go to the university, at least from that point of view. You may be getting other returns in the household sector, the marriage market, and health, and so on, but not from your earnings. Not from your earnings. Okay? So that type of increasing return is exactly the same sort we're going to use for particular skill levels. That build on, you might say, the human capital that people have based on their education, and it extends it. And there's been an enormous increase in the amount of specialization over time. I mentioned that already. There was a census taken in some of the Italian cities in the 15th century. And these cities were city-states, and they were the most developed economically, probably, centers in the world at that time. Okay? Florence, Venice. And these census generally listed a very few occupations, what we would consider very few, about 150 occupations could be found, that they thought worthwhile to distinguish and list in the census. Now if you look at cities and countries, but even cities, moderately sized cities or big cities, you find enormous specialization, thousands upon thousands of specialized occupations. And it's always amazing to, go through a phone book, which they're quickly disappearing, but we still have them in the city of Chicago, and see all the occupations that are listed. Within broad occupations, you'll find, like medicine, find enormous specialization within medicine. You can specialize in hand surgery. You can specialize in shoulder surgery, and you can specialize in brain surgery and urological surgery, breast surgery, breast cancer issues, and you can go on and on. I've only touched the surface of the degree of specialization, and that will be true for almost any occupation. And you'll find that within any city, let alone within a country as extensive as the United States. So one interesting question one should think about is why, with development, do you get more and more specialization? Is the specialization causing the development, or is the development causing the specialization? I don't know how much time I'll get to go into that question. In my view, it's some combination of the two. You can show that specialization will lead to more development, and you can also show that more development will lead to more specialization. So, you have both. And the answer we'll give will be natural to then fit that into a developing process, and certainly into a general equilibrium process. And we'll do it fit it into a general equilibrium outcomes in a simplified version. Okay? Now you have basically two fundamental approaches to trying to understand why people differ so much. Now one approach is to say, well, they differ. So you look at Shaq O'Neal. Shaq, everybody knows about him. He's like 6'2", 350 pounds, and he can move very well. Not very few people like that who can do that. So that's of course I'll come back to that. He trains and so on. He honed his skills, but he has certain properties, genetic properties, if you will, that just are scarce. And you can see that with other great athletes and musicians and people of art. So there are clearly individual intrinsic differences, and you can break those down into cognitive and non-cognitive and physical. Cognitive and non-cognitive wouldn't apply to Shaq particularly. Not that he isn't pretty intelligent, I think he is, but in addition to all that, that's not the crucial aspect that determines his particular skills, right? So people differ, and as a result of their differences, there's comparative advantage, and people sort themselves out by their comparative advantage given the demands for different skill mixes. That's sometimes, it's called usually the Roy model. in that model, people are bundles of different combinations of different skills, maybe two, they just given, and they have to, and one has to look for what kind of equilibrium would emerge with people, let's say, trying to maximize their earnings, and there's demand for different activities that require skills, different forms of skills. That's what the Roy model solves. And any ultimate equilibrium has to rely somewhat on that problem. Okay. But I've always thought that isn't a basic problem in specialization, although every model of specialization has to use that aspect. So, and what do I mean it isn't a basic problem? Well, an alternative approach is to say that everybody's identical. Another extreme. They're all identical ex ante, and they make themselves different. So the Roy model takes these differences as given, maybe by genetics, early environmental, whatever, and then you sort. The alternative approach says you start with them all being different, and you create, you start with them all being the same, and you create these differences through specializations. Now, once you create these differences, then people sort themselves in terms of, say, maximizing their expected earnings. But then the Roy problem becomes trivial to a large extent. Now, I'll show you why later on. It's still there, but it becomes trivial. So those are two different approaches. They're both correct. They both involve some. There are intrinsic differences. I mentioned the sports differences, and you can mention many others. But there's no question that people are a lot more different at age 50 than they were at age 15 or 20. People become a lot different. I mean, that would be the clearest evidence they become very different. So what we want to do is take a model, this extreme model, where everybody's initially identical, and look at what kind of differences they become given what demand there is in the marketplace and given their desire to maximize their income. Okay? That's the goal that we're going to take. Okay? So we'll get an equilibrium outcome. It'll be a simple, we're going to deal with simple examples, but you can make it much more complicated. Okay. So any questions? And the way they become different, at least what we're going to stress, is through training, learning by doing, education, other investments in human capital. Although we'll assume we already have the education. And there may be, of course, there are significant differences then, but we'll be looking at additional investments beyond the education, assuming we're dealing with people of the same education, if you will, who are identical because they had the same education. Okay. You can have, the same analysis I'm giving could be applied to allow various differences initially in abilities and so on. And I probably won't have the time to develop that, but if you, as you see it go through, you should be able to show that for yourselves. So even when it comes to sports, we would say, yes, people differ, but mainly they have to work on and invest in their skills, otherwise they're not so good. So a good example was, some of you may know, Michael Jordan was a great basketball player, maybe the greatest of all time. He was a great athlete. Still is a great athlete, only he's not playing anything professionally anymore. He thought he could be a great baseball player. So he quit after great success in basketball. He quit for 2 years to go into the minor leagues in baseball and try to make a second career as a baseball player. Well, he basically failed completely. Even though he had great skills. And he had great skills, he did. But he hadn't gone through the years of honing these skills to become maybe if he had started let's say in high school or college, instead of specializing in basketball and baseball, maybe he would have become a great baseball player. That I can't answer. Somewhat different skills are required, but some great overlaps. Okay? So he failed at that. And even when he came back to play basketball, it took him a while before he regained anything resembling his old form. So that shows that, you have to invest in skill. That's why the top professionals are practicing all the time and so on. They just can't walk out on a court and do great things, even though they have unusual abilities. So even there you have to bring in skills. Although I admit, for a lot of athletic activities, there's important intrinsic abilities that clearly play a role. So I don't want to say there are no differences in abilities in society, that everything is created. I mean, that's what Adam Smith and David Hume argued. But I think it's probably a crude approximation for a lot of problems. That isn't a bad first approximation, that acting as if everybody's identical and they hone their skills and make themselves different. But I know a much better approach would be to combine that with differences in ability. Okay? So I'm not going to go all the way back to childhood. We assume we have some adults, and we're looking at their investment, and they're going to invest in skills, maybe a bunch of skills, and different people may, in equilibrium, invest in different skills sets, and then you're going to look for an equilibrium, and it's going to have the property that demand equals supply in all activities, and workers of the same basic abilities get the same expected earnings, or lifetime earnings. That's the problem. Now we'll deal with a simple version of that problem, but that's the problem that one would be addressing. And you would address that in the Roy case, starting out with these differences. You address that in the case where you start out with everybody identical, and you address that in the case where people start with a mixture of general and of similarities and differences and then investments that occur. And as we said, the advantage of specialization in the approach we're taking is not that people have different mixtures of skills, but that it pays to develop different skills because of the increase in returns in producing skills. So it's a very different point of view with somewhat different implications, with quite a few different implications, in fact. And the increasing returns, fundamentally, we're not going to quite express it this way, but fundamentally is due to the fact that the gains, let me put it a little differently, the cost of investing to reach a certain skill level is independent of how much activity you ultimately put into that skill level. It could be learning by doing, but it's independent. So if you're putting more time into a particular skill, you can amortize that given investment cost over more and more time. That's the increase in returns. As we mentioned that for education, and we'll have a model like that, actually a static model, bringing dynamics, but a static model like that for the specialized investments that we'll be talking about. So if there are many skills, as there are in a modern economy, that are required, or tasks, sometimes I use the word tasks and sometimes I use the word skills, they are going to mean the same thing in my analysis. If you have many skills and tasks required in producing the goods required by an economy, that generally, because of these increasing returns, you expect to find extensive specialization and division of labor. May be limited by the extent of the economy, by the size of the market, or may be limited by other forces, but you'd expect to find an extensive specialization. Okay. And so, instead of this model, or not, I mean that model enters in, but I'll show you later on how it becomes a pretty simple problem. I'm going to assume one identical, oh, let me come up here. So, model. Identical individuals ex ante specialization in different skills or tasks. Cooperation among specialists to produce outputs, or you could think of, or utilities. Cooperation is in teams. So again, think of the sports analogy. You have a baseball team. There are 9 positions on a team. And there are all there's a lot of specialization. Not completely. The catcher is very different than a shortstop. A pitcher is very different from the rest of them. Even a second baseman is different than a shortstop. It looks like the same, but the arm strength required and a lot of other things are very different in those positions. Okay. Outfielders, they all look like, well, you're an outfielder, but a center field is very different in many respects than a left or right field. He has to cover more territory and so on. So you get a lot of specialization. And then they cooperate as a team to produce the outcomes. That's what they're doing. So in sports, you see that very clearly. Well, now think of an economy like that. You have a bunch of specialists, like the center fielder and the pitcher, and they cooperate to produce clothing, cars, iPads, whatever, right? They're cooperating to produce all these things. And so I'm going to call those people cooperating a team. Now, they may not be in the same firm. They may be cooperating through the market. So teams go across markets. You don't want to identify a team necessarily with a firm. Not only the firms, within firms. That's part of it. It's not the only part. But you have to think of, I mean, the issue is, you know, when you do things within the firm, when your team is mainly within the firm, when you do it mainly through the market. That's the old Coasian question. Well, what determines a firm? We're not going to try to answer that question. But I just want to stress that this is a team need not only be within the firm. Market will be a lot of components. The pen that I brought out, a lot of that was market. People bought materials from somebody and something else, ink or whatever from another, and they put it all together. The ballpoints, maybe, specialists. Adam Smith, in his famous example, broke down a pin factory, making pins. Just simple pins. Which was great. That was a great achievement of this example. It's a simple little pin. And then he said he went into like 18 occupations involved in making a pin. Okay, and he went through them all, and this and that. He must have gone to a pin factory and observed the different special. He had a lot of specialization in producing the pin. So even a simple product as that, you had a lot of specialization. And then they had to cooperate, of course. Somebody, maybe that's the entrepreneur, puts all this together and makes the pin. So maybe, think of an entrepreneur as some agent combining, making this team work well. The manager in a sports team, okay? The entrepreneur in a business team. Okay. And then markets, transactions among different sort of entrepreneurs in producing a team that goes across the firm. But a simple pin factory had specialization within the factory. Now maybe some of it, I think in Adam Smith's example, you should check it. It's a great discussion. He has everything going on within a pin factory. These are all specialization within the factory. But it could be that some of the specialists worked in one place, some in another, and they combine. There's another famous discussion in the 19th century of gun making in an area in one of the British cities. Britain was then the leading gun maker of the world. And I think it was Birmingham or so, they had a lot of small little companies that were making components of a gun or rifle, and then somebody would be involved, another company, in putting it all together, assembly. And they were all located close together, reduced transportation costs. Right? So they located together. That's another example. Well, you had detailed specialization by company or factory in this case, and that meant also within the individuals working there, because they were doing different things. They were specialized in different components of guns. Okay. So we're going to, you can see that some forms of complementarity must be important. You have this specialization, that specialization, you put them together. Right? So if you think of an economy, we have lawyers, we have doctors, we have economists, we have carpenters, and so on. We have regulators. We have a lot of different things. You put all that together, and you get what you end up as an economy. Okay? So you need them all. You don't need them all in fixed proportions, but you need them all. That's why we have them all. Right? You need them all. They're doing different things, and they're all useful, they're all demanded. So maybe a consumer wants a variety of products, so you have all these products being produced. Or even within one product, you can do. I'm going to do it within one product. But it could be a broad product, and you just need a different specialist to produce that broad product. Any questions? So, suppose there are M tests. It could be a continuum of tasks. In some analytical senses, that's a neater way to do it, but you get pretty much everything you want. If M is large, you can get pretty much everything necessary. So we can just have M, and we don't specify initially how big M is. Okay. And suppose an individual was investing in one task. Okay, so now, here, now it's going to be investment. In task-specific skills. Now, the way we did it when we were treating like schooling, we said, well, you invest now, you get it later on. We could do that here. But I'm going to make it static. So you invest now and you get it now. Okay? No matter of principle, it simplifies the problem. We don't have to go into dynamics for understanding the fundamentals of specialization. The dynamics may be useful if you're looking at the growth of an economy over time, which you can take this model that I'm giving and do. Okay, there's a different kind of dynamics. But here, everything is going on in one period. Okay, and a person invests, and how do they invest? Well, let's say we can decompose their time. Let's say they have total amount of time is T hours available. Okay. And they have to define how much they want to spend of that T hours investing in human capital. Okay. Well, the basic approach would be to say, well, they invest a certain amount depending upon what the returns are. I mean, that's the only way I know how to think about that problem, right? So we're going to think about it that way, but they're going to invest a certain amount, and the optimal amount will be at the point where the marginal returns are just going to equal their cost. That's going to be the same. I mean, in maximization, it must be something like that. Okay, so they're going, let's call H time spent investing in this task, one. So time is available, time invest. Let's say somebody's investing in one task, investing in a task. Okay. T of hours available for that task. Okay. Well, why are they investing? Because they're getting some human capital. So let's call human H. We've been using the notation of F always. I can do that now. I'm just afraid I'm going to get confused by going back and forth between G and H. So I'm going to stay with G. That's the investment function. Okay. And this is now static. It's not that H of T plus 1 and so on. It's all the same period, H of T, if you will, which is basically what we had before too. So I'm not even going to put a T notation. I'm going to have G prime is greater than 0. So the more you put into this investment, the more you get out. No problem with that. Right? I mean, that's plausible. Now, I'm going to assume diminishing returns. So I'm not going to get increasing returns out of this production function. I'm going to get diminishing returns. Now, let me say I'm going to leave open the equality case, constant returns, just for, don't need it. But I'm going to deal with some examples where I have access to constant returns. Okay? So, no increasing returns there. Diminishing returns, basically, there. Okay. So, you know, where do we get the increasing returns from? We have to have some rabbit that we can pull out of the hat, right? So we'll take a very simple formulation. So everything will be nothing tricky about it because it fundamentally is an increasing returns problem. And what's going to be the simple formulation? That H enters into earnings. So let's say we're going to call, or output, call this Y is equal to output. And Y is going to be, let's say, proportional to your effective labor input. Okay? So what do I mean by effective labor input? It's your number of hours you spend working times the productivity of each hour. Okay? So if L is hours worked at this task, then output will be dependent on L times H. That's your labor input in efficiency units. Each unit has productivity of H, or little g, right? And there'll be some productivity component here, we'll call that alpha. So I say output is proportional to your labor input in efficiency units, and alpha may vary with the productivity of an economy and so on. And maybe that's where you'd put the efficiency of different individuals, although I wouldn't tend to put it there. I would put it maybe more in the G function, as we've done before, right? We put abilities in the investment in education, you'd put abilities here in investment. So you can have a general function where G depends on H, and builds cognitive and non-cognitive. Okay? Ekman instructs me every time I put abilities to distinguish between cognitive and non-cognitive. So I'm going to do that. No, and that distinction is important. So here's what I have, cognitive and non-cognitive. Okay, and presumably, an increase in these abilities for given H raises productivity. That's how we treated it before. I'm going to suppress the abilities, so everybody's the same. So whatever is there, it's there for the same for everybody, right? It affects the G function. And you'll see, we'll allow that. All right, so what do? Well, first we recognize there's a time budget constraint that L plus H is equal to cap T. You have a certain amount of time. You either spend it at work, or you can spend it at producing human capital, effective labor. Okay? So then we have hide and seek every time. Eraser. Is there an eraser?
I think there's one on the side of.
You see one?
Yeah. On this side. It's like stuck in the hole.
Where? It's a good place, right? Okay. So the problem is you max y equal to alpha L G of H subject to L plus H is equal to T. That's it. And the property is G prime greater than 0 and G double prime less than 0. Okay. So if we do that, so we have a constrained maximization problem. Is in time where we're used to dealing with that. So you're maxing out with respect to L and H. So very simply, we would get with respect to L, we would get alpha G of H is equal to lambda, the marginal value of an additional unit of time. That's very important for the problem. And for H, it's equal to alpha L G prime of H is equal to lambda. So that's equal to alpha G of H. So actually, what's first thing clearly is the alphas drop out because the productivity of your effective unit of time affects the value of human capital in proportion to it affects, by the same proportion it affects the value of your time spent working. So it won't affect your allocation of time between these two activities. So that drops out. Okay? And with alpha dropping out, we can see that H implies H star is going to be equal to what? Well, this is L. Yeah. L. L star is going to be equal to G of H star over G prime of H star. Okay? And then we know that H is simply T minus L, so you would substitute that into this equation. Okay? I'll take an explicit form for G that I'll use a lot. Suppose G of H is equal to C times H theta, with theta is less than or equal to 1 greater than 0. I mean, you could say greater than or equal to 0, but theta is 0, you're not getting anything. That's one extreme, so you could have that. Right? If theta is 1, it doesn't mean you're going to invest all your time in producing H. Right? You'll never want to do that, because you need some L to get output. But you could have a situation where you don't produce any H, just use L. You can get output assuming you have a function where G of 0 is not 0, as in this case. So H is equal to, yeah, that wouldn't work. Yeah, you're going to have some, in this function, I mean, there may be other functional forms where you would have it. This functional form, you can't have it. If H is 0, this is 0, then the output is 0. That's not optimal. Okay. Suppose that's our functional form. We see then L star, now we can write it out as G of H. Now notice C here, or C may be a function of abilities. So that's right. So here you can bring abilities in and affecting people's productivity. Maybe theta is too, but C would be a natural place to put abilities in. Scales up your productivity. And it certainly is going to affect your allocation of time between investing and working. That will affect it. Okay. So I'll take C as given because everybody's identical again. So I get L star is equal to G over G prime, which is C theta over H theta minus 1, right? So the C's drop out. And C's drop out for the same reason as before, that the allocation won't depend upon C because it affects the productivity of L and H proportionally. So that drops out. And so what we're left with is L star is equal to what? H star over theta? So then we substitute into our equation, L plus H is equal to T, so we get H over theta plus H is equal to T, and that implies that H is equal to theta over 1 plus theta of T, right? And therefore L is equal to 1 over 1 plus theta of T. Okay, so here we solve with this functional form. Simply, you do it in general. This functional form brings out a lot of the properties. First of all, the smaller theta, the more sharply is the concavity in the G function. Smaller theta, the more sharply the concavity. The smaller is H relative to L. Yeah?
This is a minor point, but I think it doesn't look like that if you had put the ability in the C function, it would actually affect your allocation of time.
It would affect it?
It wouldn't. Well, it's
No, I said it wouldn't.
Oh, sorry.
C doesn't affect.
Misunderstood.
Well, C isn't here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, no, it doesn't. So I'm not sure, it's not, in this formulation, yes, ability will affect, you'll see where ability will affect your output, but it won't affect your allocation of time. Now, in the education case, it did, right? In the education case, it did, because we didn't have proportionality between C and your productivity of your working time and the other. So it did affect it, although you can set up simple models of investment in human capital where ability doesn't affect your allocation either, doesn't affect your optimal investment. You see why? Can you think of a model? Well, let me give you one. Unless you have one where you're really eager to make. One simple model. The only cost of education is foregone earnings. And that ability affects your earnings proportionally, including your foregone earnings. So then if we looked at it, if we go back to our investment in education equations, we got something like, go over here, back to some function of interest rate and time. And that's going to be equal to, foregone earnings, so W times some cost would be 1 minus time spent at college would be T time spent at college time. That, I mean, that's fundamentally what we have, and you look for the optimal time spent investing. And suppose W at all periods is just simply equal to abilities times W time, okay? So then if this, when you increase the, so this, you have to factor out the abilities here, factor out the abilities here, and ability drops off. It's like a proportional income tax. Remember we said a proportional earning tax wouldn't affect the optimal investment. That's it. In this simple model, it would be the same. It wouldn't have any effect. So it isn't so anomalous than the example we gave here, making a function of C. Now we can make it a function of theta, and it will have an effect, right? So it could have an effect. In this case, it clearly doesn't. It's not in here. Okay? So I was saying, though, the smaller theta, the more the concavity, so the more the diminishing returns to putting time in, and the less you're going to put into H, right? Theta is equal to 1. Suppose theta was equal to 1. Constant returns. Well, this leads to, if theta equal to 1, so in that case, you just divide it 50-50 between investment and learning. Investment and work. Okay? Any questions? All right, so two points. One, you can see why we're getting increasing returns, right? Look at T. This, well, sorry, you can't see it. But this, as an input to understanding why we're getting increasing returns, is look at these things, in this simple case, are proportional to T. And the factor of proportionality is some function of theta, right? But somehow you got to combine these two things in order to get output. So if there's going to be increasing returns, we have to look at output. And is there increasing returns in output? Well, let's now look at output. All right, so bring all this down. Look at output. So to get output, we just have to look at the definition of output and substitute back in our optimal H's and L's. Right, we get output. So let's do that. Let's do it first with the general G function, then with the specific G function. So if we look at the general G function, then we know that L output Y star is going to be alpha times L star times G of H star. That's going to be alpha. You know, alpha is not going to drop out now, optimal output. L star we know is G H star over G prime H star, right? And then we multiply that times G of H star. We get G of H star alpha times G of H star squared over G prime of H star. The square is where we're getting the increasing returns. Okay? That shows why we're getting increasing returns. And to be explicit about it, to be explicit, let's say we substitute in for G, like we did before. Notice now output does depend upon productivity. So the allocation of time between the sectors didn't depend on productivity in the marketplace. Alpha is a market parameter, presumably. Or skill specific parameter, I should say. And allocation didn't depend upon alpha, but output depends on alpha. It's better to be more productive than less productive. Right? You don't have any problem with that. Yeah. No. All right. So alpha enters into that. Well, see, C also enters here. Okay, so this is our equation. Now, to look at various other components, let's go back to our approximation. If G is equal to H sigma. And let's plug it in. So we get Y star is equal to alpha. Now G squared, so that's C squared times H of 2 theta, right? Divided by, we'll do it this way. All right, yeah. Divided by G prime, which is C theta over H theta minus 1. Alpha stays here. That C is just plain C. And so we have is equal to alpha times H, alpha C times H. So theta plus 1 plus theta, right? Right? All right, but we know what H is. Just have to find it. H theta over 1 plus theta t. So now we can say, substituting in for the optimal H, alpha C, theta over 1 plus theta times t, all raised to the 1 plus theta power. Okay.
I think you dropped in theta.
Pardon me?
In the third step, or second step, you dropped in theta. You divided by theta on the bottom.
What, here?
Yeah.
Yeah, right, I should have a theta here. Right. up with? We end up with alpha c over theta, theta over 1 plus theta to 1 plus theta. So it's a, it's not, it's a function of theta in a particular way, which we'll use, and then t to the 1 plus theta. And the last term is important. That t is not proportional to t, it's not diminishing in t, it's increasing returns in t with any positive theta. So that's what I mean by increasing returns. The more time you put into this task, if you double your time, you more than double your output. That's what we mean by increasing returns. If this was t to some power less than 1, you'd have diminishing returns. If this was t to the first power, you'd have a constant return. But it's not a constant returns to scale problem. It's an increasing returns to scale problem. Now, often in economics we deal with diminishing returns, so we don't get such specialization. But to understand skill formation, specialization is the heart of the problem. And specialization is associated with increasing returns. You don't sort of diversify. See, portfolio theory, you diversify because of risk, basic concavity, and how much risk you have. Here, you don't diversify. You concentrate. Now, if you bring in uncertainty, you can have a force toward diversification, or even that's a little more complicated. Maybe I'll have a chance to say something about it, but if not, if anybody asks me about it. Okay? So here, now this is a function of, and here what's also the important thing is now no longer, obviously, alpha enters here, and C, even if C doesn't affect your allocation of time, it does affect your optimal output. It's better to be more able, as in the human capital problem. It's make more earnings if you're able. It's better to be more able. It may not affect your optimal investment, although in general it will, but it may not, but it still affect your earning power. That's what we have here. Okay. And then the theta, well, you would expect the higher theta, the bigger its output, because the less the diminishing returns to investment. So if you have less diminishing returns, you can't be worse off, right? If you have weaker diminishing returns, or less strong diminishing returns, you have to be better off in general. All right, so if we take a particular value, suppose theta is equal to 1, suppose. And we can get an formula. We get alpha c, and this is 1 over 1/2. 1 over 2 is a half. Raised to the 2 power, that's a quarter, times 3 squared. So I can't tell you why you get 4 there, although I can tell you in a sense, but I'll show you more generally later on. It has to do, it's a function of the number, ultimately it's going to be a function of the number of tasks that you're doing, but let's hold that for now. All right, but with t squared, well, alpha is 1, no diminishing returns to producing investments, you get increasing returns, of course, we get it in a strong way. So having t squared, that's really powerful increasing returns. And on the other hand, if theta is very low, you don't get that much increase. It's 1 plus theta, so if theta is 1/10, you're only getting a 10% increasing returns, not that much. So theta clearly matters. The degree of concavity in that function clearly matters. But no matter what concavity there is, you're going to get increasing returns. So the increasing returns is not coming from making an assumption that you have increasing returns in producing human capital. You get diminishing returns in producing human capital. And for all diminishing returns, you get increasing, in this way we've set it up, you get increasing returns in output. And I think that's fundamental. That's a fundamental truth in specialization in human capital. It's not an accident of the example I took. It's a fundamental truth. that there's a fundamentally built-in increase in returns to investing in human capital. Okay? Any questions? Now, let me generalize the problem. So you had two tasks you had to perform, and you had a total amount of time, cap T. Okay? The two tasks. And suppose you have task 1 and task 2, G1 of H1, G2 of H2, and you have H1 plus L1 is equal to T1, H2 plus L2 is equal to T2, and T1 plus T2 is equal to T. Right? Question? No, okay. That's what we have. I mean, just saying there are two tasks, you're dividing your time between the two tasks, independent, so the production in each task, now this is an assumption, depends only on the time you put into that task. There may be some dependency, but as long as that dependency is significantly imperfect, this will be a pretty good approximation. Right? So let's say you want to be an engineer, a skilled engineer, and a skilled doctor. So you put some time in becoming a doctor, some time in becoming an engineer. There's not too much linkage between them. There may be a little, but not too much. So now, well, basically, we solved each of these. We would say, we can solve for the optimal time. I won't go through all that. We know what that is. We would say y1 star is going to be equal to what? Well, we go back to our formula here. Alpha 1, C1 over theta 1 times theta 1 over 1 plus theta 1 to the 1 plus theta 1 times T1 to the 1 plus theta 1, and y2 star is equal Now, you see the problem here. Already, if you're doing two tasks, well, these things look the same. That's okay. No problem with those. But what about the little t's? You're doing two tasks. These look. This should be T1, T2. Okay? T2, T2. You're doing two tasks, you have to take that total amount of t that you have and divide it. So in each of these tasks, in general, you have less than the cap t. You can't have more. They just have to sum to t. But if you have less than cap t, if you look at the increasing return, suppose, for example, that ti is equal to t over 2. You're dividing your time equally between the tasks. Suppose. Well then, all this stuff is the same. You would get yi star is going to be equal to alpha I ci, etc., 1 plus theta I, and then you're going to have t over 2 to the 1 plus theta I, okay? So, instead of having t here, you're only going to be having half the t, and so that's the effect of cutting this in half is not going to be simply cutting y in half, right? The effect, well, factor it out. It's going to be all that stuff. I'm just going to put all this stuff in the brackets. T over 1 plus theta I, divided by 2 to the 1 plus theta I. So if theta I was 0, it'd just be cutting it in half. But it's doing more than cutting it in half. Let's say if each of the thetas was 1, you're dividing it by 4 rather than 2. So by cutting your time in half, you're going to end up not cutting your outputs in half, but cutting your outputs by 3/4, or going to 1/4 of what your output was before. That's what's important. Okay. Now, why might this arise? Well, suppose you had some overall output function, Q. Suppose you had Q, and that's some function, of y1 and y2. Okay? And y1 and y2 are not perfect substitutes. Well, that means, in general, you want to produce some of y1 and some of y2. So, but by doing that, you can't put all your time in any one of the tasks. So if the overall output function combines tasks in a way where they're not perfect substitutes, you're losing not simply proportional if you have to do more than one task, but more than proportionally because of the increasing returns working downward. Let me show you that with a specific example. An example I'm going to use a lot. Strong complementarity. So what's an example of strong complementarity? Well, if you say that Q is equal to the min of y1 and y2. So this is a Leonti, called a Leonti fixed production function. Fixed proportions is what it means. That you can't get anything by adding one factor alone. Right? The marginal productivity is 0, really, of adding one alone, but adding jointly, you get something. All right, suppose that's true. Well then, what do we know about the equilibrium outputs in that case? Michael Wood. See here? Yeah. So the question is, before you ask me to repeat the question, I'll repeat the question. The question is, suppose you have fixed proportion. What do you know about the outputs, equilibrium outputs in that case?
Fixed proportions?
In the particular way I wrote it, yeah, fixed proportions. The output is the min of the y's.
They should be equal.
You're going to obviously going to equal the y's, okay? All right. Now, what that does, suppose that's true, that is true, implies no question about that. Because having more of one thing doesn't give you anything. Of equal y's. Suppose that y1 is more productive. The alphas and the c's, say, are higher in y1 than they are in y2. Task 1 rather than task 2. Where do you put more time? Why don't you continue?
Sorry, say again?
All right. Repeat the question, right? Yes.
Which one?
Task 1 is more productive than task 2.
Okay, you put more time in the one that's more productive.
Well, let's say you did. You'd get more output there.
Oh, I'm sorry, you want to equalize that, but that's right, so you put less there.
You actually put less time. I mean, the weakest link I mean, this is a case where the weakest link is determining your productivity. So you have to put a lot of time into the thing where you're not very good at, right? That's a reason why, I mean, that's kind of the Royce idea. I mean, in a particular case, the weakest link is going to determine where you allocate your time, if you have difference in productivities. So we'll get that out of, that comes out of here immediately. So if we solve now, see, here are our two equations. Let me first assume, let's assume that alpha I is equal to alpha, ci is equal to c, theta I is equal to theta. So the production functions are the same. Okay? And all these things are the same, but now we can solve now, we can add the additional equation y1 star is equal to y2 star. So we set these terms equal to each other. I'll write them down. But all this, well, all this, hey, let me write it down. Alpha 1 C1 over theta 1 times theta 1 over 1 plus theta 1. Sorry, alpha C, they're all equal. 1 plus theta, T1 to the 1 plus theta is equal to alpha C theta, theta over 1 plus theta to 1 plus theta, T2 to 1 plus theta. All this stuff drops out. All this stuff drops out. You have T1 to 1 plus theta is equal to T2, implies T1 star is equal to T2. Star is equal to T over 2. So in that particular case, when everything is equally productive, and you have this ante production, you put the same amount of time into both. And the problem then, when you put the same amount of time into both, you would see the output on each, and y1, y2 star is equal to what? It's equal to T over 2 to the 1 plus theta. There, let me take the case. So, suppose theta is 1. If theta is equal to 1, let's say. Well then, we would have, what's output? Well, this is output, so we'd have equals alpha C, over theta is 1, this is a half, that's half, over 4. That's the same as before when we had only one activity. So then it would be T over 2 squared, so that's alpha C T squared over 16. Not 4 anymore, but 16. Remember the case when we assumed theta is equal to 1, we had someplace. Well, we had it before. I don't think oh yeah, over here. Right up here. Alpha C T squared over 4, alpha C T squared over 4, but then we multiply it by another 4. So your productivity is on each test is only 1/4 of what it would be if you were fully specialized. That's a big effect. Now, that's the maximum effect because of the assumption of theta equals to 1. But it's 1 plus theta, so the denominator would be over 4 times 2 to the 1 plus theta. Right? So as long as theta is not really small, you get a big effect. So what have we shown? Well, we've shown if somebody has to do 2 tasks, and if they're both needed, and by needed, I'm defining needed by being in a ante production function situation, both needed, 2 tasks, both needed, then you suffer a lot from not being able to specialize in one of these tasks. Okay? Well now, Oh, there are two other things I want to show. Now suppose, a little more, slightly more complicated, but not much, and I want to prove the point we had before. Suppose we had, suppose alpha 1 is equal to alpha 2 is equal to alpha, theta 1 is equal to theta 2 is equal to theta, but C1 is not equal to C2. Maybe C1 greater than C2. You're more productive in the first activity. That's the question you were answering before. Right? Now let's go back to our equilibrium. Well, we're setting the y's equal to each other. So the alphas and the thetas all drop out of this equation. And what would we have? We'd have C1 times T1 times T1 to the 1 plus theta, right? All the other stuff drops out. It's going to be equal to C2 times T2 to the 1 plus theta. Suppose C1 is greater than C2. Clearly implies T1 is less than T2. Right? So if you're more productive in task 1, you put less time into task 1. You put more time into the less productive task. If C1 is much more productive, if task 1 is much more productive than task 2, that difference can be substantial. Let's take the case where C1 is equal to twice C2, and that theta is equal to 1. What would we get? We'd get 2C2 times T1 squared is equal to C2 times T2 squared. Okay? So T1 squared is equal to T2 squared, and T1 is equal to T2 divided by what? The square root of 2. Right? Taking the square root of both sides. I'm always sliding it down, but that's what the equation is. So square root of 2 is what, 1.41 or something like that? Right? So it's a big difference. Big difference. All right, that's one point I want to make. Second point, and then we'll finish, is okay. Yeah. Suppose you're M task. All right. Well, the M task. Let's take a simple case. Erase it down here again. Up here. Let's say they're M tasks. All right. M tasks. Well, you go through everything and now you have Q is equal to min Y1 up to Ym. Okay. Let's assume full symmetry now. Everything is, so alpha I is equal to alpha, Ci is equal to C, theta I is equal to 1. Well, then we can solve for our equations, and we can see everything's going to be symmetrical, and that Ti is going to be equal to T over M, right? Put the same amount of time into each task, right? And then if we look at optimal output on each task, yi star, that's going to be a function of all this stuff. The important point is going to be n times ti squared, and that's going to be equal this stuff. That's going to be a function of theta c alpha. So that stuff times t over m squared, or this stuff times t squared over m squared. So if m is 2, that's 4. Remember we had 4? If m is 5, that's 25. You have to do 5 tasks. You're equally productive. You're cutting your output on each task by 25-fold relative to if you were concentrating. So it multiplies up enormously. So what do we learn from that? Nothing, right? But we do learn something. What we learn is that there's a huge gain from specialization. If the world looked anywhere like it. Now fixed proportions is a strong assumption, but you can weaken that and so on. But you can see how there could be a tremendous gain from specialization. Nothing is proportional in this world. And so next time, why don't we go into that somewhat and finish up. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of time to spend on it, but much of the next lecture we'll finish up some of it. But any questions before we conclude? Do you have any questions on any of this?